In the far reaches of space, where war never truly ends, one universe stands above the rest in legend, tragedy, and endless conflict. This is StarCraft, a galaxy torn between three unstoppable forces. The disciplined but fractured Terrans, the ancient and powerful Protoss, and the Zerg, a swarm driven by evolution, instinct, and absolute destruction. But behind every battlefield, every fallen world, and every last stand, there are stories. Stories of betrayal, of sacrifice, of ambition powerful enough to reshape entire civilizations. And at the center of it all stand unforgettable figures. Warriors, ghosts, emperors, and queens whose choices change the fate of the Koprulu Sector forever. This is not just the story of a game. This is the story of war on a galactic scale, of heroes becoming monsters. And monsters becoming legends. Welcome to the beginning. Welcome to StarCraft.
Tonight, let us travel slowly and quietly into the deep and ancient darkness between the stars. Allow your breathing to soften. Let the noise of the day drift farther away. And as the world around you grows still, let your mind wander into a distant future, into a cold and beautiful galaxy, filled with silent worlds, ancient civilizations, forgotten powers, and a conflict so vast that it stretches across planets, species, and ages beyond memory. This is the world of StarCraft, a universe of war, yes, but also of mystery, a universe of empires and ruin, of faith and betrayal, of transformation and destiny. And tonight, we will not rush through it. We will move slowly, gently, one story at a time, beginning at the oldest place possible, long before the Terrans, long before the Protoss, and long before the terrible swarms of the Zerg darkened the stars. To understand StarCraft, we must begin with being so old and so powerful that even the greatest civilizations of the galaxy knew them only as legend. These beings were known as the Xel'Naga. The Xel'Naga were not merely travelers and not simply gods in the ordinary sense of the word. They were ancient cosmic shapers, beings who moved through the universe with immense intelligence and purpose. They searched the stars not for conquest, not for wealth, and not for survival, but for creation. They believed in a grand design. They believed that life across the universe could be guided, cultivated, and elevated toward perfection. Again and again, they journeyed from world to world, observing, shaping, and testing the species they discovered. Their goal was not random experimentation. It was something far greater. They sought what they called purity. But to the Xel'Naga, purity did not mean moral goodness or simple beauty. It meant two very specific qualities. The first was purity of form. The second was purity of essence. Purity of form meant a species whose physical being was perfect, strong, adaptable, capable of surviving in countless conditions, capable of rapid evolution and change. Purity of essence meant something far more inward, a species whose mind, spirit, and psionic potential were elevated, unified, and profound. The Xel'Naga believed that if these two forms of purity could ever be brought together, the result would be something extraordinary. a life form beyond anything the universe had yet seen, a culmination of their design, a final harmony between body and spirit. So they searched. Across ages beyond counting, they searched. And in time, they found, or believed they had found, the first half of that great vision. On a distant world called Xeris, they discovered savage, primal life, organisms of incredible ferocity and adaptability. These creatures were not civilized. They were not peaceful. They did not build cities or write philosophies or gaze calmly into the stars. They hunted. They devoured. They evolved. Life on Xeris existed in a state of relentless competition, where only strength, adaptation, and transformation ensured survival. It was a brutal world, but to the Xel'Naga, it was also a promising one. Because here, in this endless struggle, they saw the thing they had sought: purity of form. The life of Xeris could change rapidly. It could absorb strengths. It could adapt to threats. It could become something new again and again. It was fluid, ruthless, and efficient. The Xel'Naga began to shape this life, guiding its evolution with their ancient methods, trying to perfect what nature had begun. And from this process emerged the earliest foundations of what would one day become the Zerg. But that story, the full awakening of the swarm, would come later. For now, let us leave Xeris behind, with its violent jungles and savage evolutionary tides, and travel to another world entirely. A world very different in spirit. A world of golden skies, calm beauty, and growing consciousness. This world was Aiur. It was here that the Xel'Naga found the second half of their dream. On Aiur lived a species unlike the beasts of Xeris. These beings were intelligent, sensitive, and deeply connected to psionic energy. Their minds held immense potential. Their spirits were bright and resonant. They possessed intuition, perception, and a natural closeness to forces greater than the physical world. These were the ancestors of the Protoss. To the Xel'Naga, the beings of Aiur represented purity of essence. Here at last was a race whose inner nature seemed to reflect the elevated consciousness the Xel'Naga had sought for so long. The Protoss were not yet the advanced civilization they would later become. They existed in tribal societies, divided into distinct groups, still growing, still learning, still bound in many ways to the natural rhythms of their world. But their potential was unmistakable, and so the Xel'Naga remained with them. They guided them, they nurtured them, they taught them. Under this influence, the Protoss began to develop rapidly. Their minds sharpened, their psionic gifts expanded. Their society grew more structured, more refined, more aware of itself and of the greater universe. In time, the relationship between the Xel'Naga and the Protoss became profoundly important to the Protoss identity itself. The ancient beings were not viewed merely as teachers. They were seen as divine caretakers, wise and luminous creators who had uplifted the Protoss and shown them a path toward a higher existence. But not everything unfolded as the Xel'Naga intended. The Protoss were powerful, yes. Intelligent, yes. Spiritually gifted, absolutely. But they were not passive. They were not empty vessels waiting to be shaped forever. As Protoss civilization advanced, so too did pride, independence, and complexity. Individual thought deepened. Tribal differences remained. Questions emerged. Doubt appeared. And the closer the Protoss came to realizing their own greatness, the less they wished to exist merely as subjects within another species' design. The Xel'Naga, for all their wisdom, had overlooked something important. Conscious beings do not remain still under guidance forever. Eventually, they begin to ask who guides the guides. They begin to wonder why they were made and for what purpose. And when answers are unclear, trust begins to fracture. Tensions grew between the Protoss and the Xel'Naga. What had once seemed like a sacred relationship became more uncertain. Some Protoss likely still revered the ancient beings, while others grew wary of them. The Protoss were awakening not only to power, but to autonomy. Then came the moment that changed everything. One night, for reasons still shrouded in uncertainty and conflicting memory, the Protoss turned against the Xel'Naga. Whether it was fear, resentment, misunderstanding, or a sudden eruption of long-buried resistance, the result was catastrophic. The Xel'Naga on Aiur were attacked. Many were killed. The survivors fled, and in their departure, they left behind more than ruins. They left behind a wound in Protoss history, and a mystery that would echo across all future ages. Why did it happen? Did the Protoss truly reject their creators in pride and anger? Did they sense manipulation and resist it? Was there some deeper influence at work, some hidden corruption or unspoken truth? Across later centuries, different interpretations would exist, and certainty would remain elusive. But one thing was clear: the bond was broken. The Xel'Naga abandoned Aiur, and the Protoss were left alone. Now, loneliness in myth is often a tragedy, but in StarCraft, loneliness becomes destiny. Without the Xel'Naga, the Protoss had to define themselves. They could no longer look upward for identity. They could no longer rely on divine guidance. They had to become their own civilization. And so they did. Over long ages, the Protoss transformed Aiur into a radiant and highly advanced world. Their technology became astonishing. Their architecture rose in gleaming lines and elegant forms. Their society developed order, philosophy, hierarchy, and deep traditions. But beneath all of this progress remained an old problem. The Protoss were powerful individuals, and powerful individuals often struggle to remain united. Their tribes, philosophies, and personal ambitions created conflict. Their psionic gifts, so extraordinary and so central to their identity, also made division dangerous. The Protoss were not merely people who could argue. They were beings of immense mental and spiritual force. Discord among them was not small. It was profound. At times, this division led to tension and violence, threatening the stability of Protoss civilization itself. What saved them, or at least gave them a path forward, was one of the most important developments in their entire history. They discovered a way to commune through shared psionic connection. This communal matrix of thought and emotion became known as the Kala. The Kala was more than communication. It was more than telepathy. It was a spiritual and social framework that connected Protoss minds, allowing them to feel one another's emotions, intentions, and inner states. Through the Kala, understanding deepened. Isolation lessened. Harmony became possible in a way unlike anything known among humans or most other life forms. It did not erase individuality entirely, but it placed each Protoss within a greater whole. And under the teachings of the philosopher and mystic Kaz, the Kala became the foundation of a new Protoss order. Kaz taught that through discipline, shared thought, and unity of spirit, the Protoss could overcome the chaos that had once divided them. The Kala was both a path to peace and a structure of civilization. It shaped politics, spirituality, social life, and identity itself. Through it, the Protoss became a grand and coordinated civilization. But not all Protoss accepted this path. There were some who refused the Kala. Some did not trust such unity. Others saw danger in surrendering the privacy of the mind. Some wished to preserve older ways. And some, perhaps, simply could not accept a system that bound every inner life to a communal order. These dissenters would one day become known as the Dark Templar. But their story, like the full tragedy of Protoss division, lies farther ahead. For now, on Aiur, the Kala brought strength. Under its influence, the Protoss rose into a golden age. Their cities gleamed, their fleets expanded, their knowledge deepened. Their reverence for history and discipline made them one of the most formidable civilizations in the galaxy. And still, somewhere in the great dark beyond known space, the consequences of the Xel'Naga's older experiments continued to unfold. Because while the Protoss were building temples and starships, while they were shaping philosophy and empire, life on Xeris had not stopped changing. It had not paused. It had not become peaceful. The primal organisms there continued to evolve under savage conditions, driven by hunger and adaptation. Over immense stretches of time, these life forms developed toward greater complexity, greater aggression, and greater potential for directed transformation. Eventually, from this evolutionary violence, a central intelligence emerged. This intelligence would come to dominate and unify the swarm. It would become known as the Overmind. The Overmind was not simply a ruler in the ordinary sense. It was a vast collective consciousness, ancient, alien, and terrifyingly focused. Through it, the separate organisms of the Zerg could be directed toward one will. Through it, the chaos of predatory evolution became organized conquest. The Overmind inherited, in a twisted and powerful way, the Xel'Naga dream of purity of form. But unlike the Protoss, who built meaning through culture and discipline, the Zerg perfected themselves through consumption. They absorbed, they adapted, they reshaped. Every species encountered by the Zerg became a possible source of strength. Useful traits were stolen and integrated. Weakness was discarded. Identity itself was consumed in service of the swarm. The Zerg did not ask what was right. They asked what was effective. And under the Overmind, they became one of the most dangerous forces the galaxy had ever known. But the Overmind was not a free being. Not completely. For behind even the rise of the Zerg lay another shadow, another will, another ancient surviving intelligence connected to the Xel'Naga past. This was Aemon, a fallen Xel'Naga. Aemon had turned away from the old cycle and the old vision. Where the original Xel'Naga had sought transcendence through creation, Amon sought domination, corruption, and ultimate control. He saw existing life not as a sacred possibility, but as material to be bent toward his own end. At some point, through means vast and complex, Aemon came to influence the Overmind. This influence would become one of the darkest truths in the history of StarCraft. Because the Overmind's great purpose, the thing driving its endless expansion, was not merely survival, nor even conquest for its own sake. The Overmind had been directed toward the Protoss, toward Aiur, toward the beings of purity of essence. The old Xel'Naga dream had not disappeared. It had become distorted, perverted, weaponized. By forcing the Zerg, the embodiment of purity of form, to seek and absorb the Protoss, the embodiment of purity of essence, Amon intended to create something terrible. A final union, not of harmony, but of domination. In this way, the oldest history of the galaxy was already reaching toward catastrophe. The Protoss, in their golden age, did not yet fully understand this threat. The Zerg, in their expanding swarm, moved according to impulses and directives whose deepest origins they did not fully choose. And humanity, the Terrans, had not yet fully entered the stage. But they would. And when they did, they would not arrive as noble heroes or enlightened explorers. They would arrive as exiles, as survivors, as descendants of prisoners, political dissidents, and unwanted people sent into deep space by a collapsing old Earth order. Their story would begin not with glory, but with desperation, and it would change the balance of the galaxy forever. But before we reach the Terrans, let us remain here a little longer, in the ancient age. Imagine Aiur in its splendor, vast golden structures beneath luminous skies, Protoss warriors training in discipline and honor, mystics contemplating the currents of the Kala, great ships suspended in silent orbit above a world that seems eternal. And then imagine, far away, beyond the reach of their calm certainty, worlds stripped by swarm consumption, the movement of living fleets, the endless song of biological hunger, the Overmind gathering strength, the first hidden movements of destiny drawing three future peoples toward one another. The beauty of StarCraft has always lived in this contrast: high civilization and primal hunger, sacred unity and ruthless assimilation, faith and manipulation, freedom and control. Nothing in this universe remains simple for long. Even the oldest myths are not stable. The gods are flawed. The creators abandon their children. The children become conquerors. The search for perfection produces horror as often as wonder. And all of this, all of it, begins before the first Marine fires a rifle, before the first battlecruiser enters orbit, before Sara Kerrigan becomes a name feared across the stars. It begins here, with the Xel'Naga, with Aiur, with Xerxes, with the first shaping of destiny across the cold silence of space. So as this story settles around you, let the galaxy grow wider in your mind. Let the stars drift quietly overhead, and remember that before there were wars of Terran, Protoss, and Zerg, there was a much older design, a design born in hope, broken by pride, twisted by corruption, and set in motion across ages until no one, not prophet, not emperor, not warrior, not swarm, could remain untouched by it. In the next part, we will move forward into the rise of humanity among the stars, the long journey from Earth, the birth of the Terran Confederacy, and the fragile, violent frontier worlds that prepared the way for the great conflict to come. For now, rest here, in the ancient beginning, in the first age, in the age before history became war. Now, let us continue. The stars are still above us. The ancient stories of the Xel'Naga, the Protoss, and the Zerg still linger in the darkness, like old echoes moving softly through the galaxy. But now the scene begins to change. We leave behind the oldest age for a while and turn our attention toward a younger people. Not young in spirit, perhaps, for humanity carries with it a long and often troubled past, but young in galactic terms. Compared to the Protoss, humanity is brief. Compared to the Xel'Naga, humanity is almost like a spark. And yet, in StarCraft, that spark becomes something astonishing. Because the Terrans do not enter the story as masters of their fate. They enter it as the descendants of the unwanted. Their beginning among the stars is not glorious. It is not noble. It is not the tale of a united species reaching proudly into the heavens with hope and wonder. It is the story of exile. A story of political failure, social collapse, punishment, control, and survival. Long before the familiar battlefields of Sara, Tarsonis, Char, or Aiur, humanity lived only on Earth. Old Earth, in the distant future, had become a world of immense strain and corruption. Its systems of power were unstable. Its governments were harsh. Populations had grown vast. Political unrest spread. Social order fractured. Different factions competed for influence. Crime, rebellion, and ideological conflict deepened the crisis. In response to this instability, a powerful regime emerged. This ruling force became known as the United Powers League, often shortened to the UPL. The UPL claimed to represent order, human purity, and the restoration of civilization. It sought to control Earth and preserve its idea of what humanity should be. It presented itself as a solution to chaos. But solutions built on fear often become something else. The UPL was authoritarian. It was severe. It imposed strict standards of genetic purity, political loyalty, and social control. Those who were seen as undesirable, political dissidents, criminals, extremists, rebels, augmented individuals, and many others who did not fit the League's vision, were marked for removal. Some were imprisoned, some were silenced, and some were chosen for a very different fate. Rather than keep every unwanted person on Earth, the UPL approved a colonization and exile project, a mission that would send selected humans far away from the old world. Officially, this could be framed as a kind of expansion. In truth, it was also disposal, a way to remove unstable populations and difficult people by casting them outward into space. Thousands of these exiles, many cryogenically frozen, were loaded onto great automated colony ships. They were given supplies, systems, machinery, and destination protocols, all intended to carry them across impossible distances to habitable worlds where they could begin again, or at least disappear from Earth's central concerns. There were several such colony vessels. Among them were the Naglfar, the Serengo, and the Argo. These massive ships were sent out into the void with the expectation that their passengers would either build new lives or be forgotten. It is a cold beginning, really. Humanity in the Koprulu Sector does not begin with shared idealism. It begins with society's cast-offs drifting through deep space, under the guidance of systems never meant to ask how they felt about their fate. And then, things went wrong. Somewhere during the voyage, the navigation systems of the colony ships failed. Whether through malfunction, cosmic interference, accident, sabotage, or the great indifference of space itself, the journey did not proceed as intended. Instead of reaching their planned destinations, the ships were hurled off course by unimaginable distance. They traveled far beyond the original path, far beyond the reach of old Earth, far beyond the expectations of those who had sent them away. In time, the surviving ships arrived not where they were meant to go, but in a remote region of space that would later become known as the Koprulu Sector. This distance mattered, because it did more than separate the colonists from Earth. It severed them. Their descendants would not grow as merely an extension of old human civilization. They would become something else. They would become the Terrans of StarCraft, not Earth's polished representatives, not humanity in its ideal form, but frontier humanity, harsh, adaptive, suspicious, inventive, violent, ambitious, fragmented, and endlessly resilient. When the survivors first arrived in the Koprulu Sector, they faced a brutal challenge. The colony ships had sustained damage, resources were limited, their intended plans had collapsed, and the worlds before them were not waiting kindly to receive them. Still, they endured. Some colonists settled on worlds such as Tarsonis, Moria, and Umoja. These planets became the foundations of later Terran civilization in the sector. Their early years were difficult. Infrastructure had to be built from almost nothing. Systems had to be improvised. Power structures emerged quickly, often under pressure and often without much kindness. The people who settled these worlds were descendants of exiles, prisoners, militants, radicals, and marginalized groups. But over time, those distinctions blurred. New generations were born who no longer saw themselves as the rejected remnants of Earth. They saw themselves as pioneers, as survivors, as the inheritors of dangerous worlds. Tarsonis, in particular, grew into something major. It became the political and cultural heart of what would later be the Terran Confederacy. But we are not there yet. At first, these human colonies were scattered, fragile, and uncertain. Communication between worlds was limited. Technology had to be maintained and adapted. Survival required practical thinking more than philosophy. The Terrans learned to work with what they had, and what they had was a strange inheritance. On one hand, they possessed advanced technology, spacecraft, weapon systems, industrial equipment, and enough scientific knowledge to build a functioning civilization. On the other hand, their societies were unstable from the very beginning. Their founding populations were not unified by trust. They were people shaped by exile, force, and necessity. This combination would define Terran culture for centuries. The Terrans were resourceful. They could build. They could fight. They could salvage, modify, repurpose, and survive. But they were also deeply vulnerable to corruption, greed, and authoritarianism. In this way, they reflected something very human. Their greatest strengths and greatest flaws grew side by side. As generations passed, the colonies became more established. Cities rose, industry expanded, trade emerged, political systems formed. But these systems did not lead to peace. Instead, the sector became divided between powerful human groups, each shaped by different economic interests, philosophies, and ambitions. Eventually, among the most important of these factions was the Terran Confederacy. The Confederacy was centered on Tarsonis and became the dominant political power in the Koprulu Sector. On paper, it represented human unity and governance. In practice, it was often corrupt, self-serving, and ruthless. It maintained order through force, propaganda, and exploitation, especially in the outer colonies. If old Earth had cast humanity into exile through authoritarian logic, then the Confederacy repeated that pattern in new form. It became powerful, wealthy, and bureaucratic, but also indifferent to the suffering of those beyond its secure center. Tarsonis prospered. The outer colonies paid the price. This imbalance created resentment, and resentment, in frontier societies armed with starships and weapons, rarely remains quiet forever. Alongside the Confederacy, other powers also emerged. There was the Kelmorian Combine, heavily industrial, economically aggressive, and shaped by mining and corporate interests. The Kelmorians developed a powerful identity of their own, and conflict with the Confederacy would become inevitable. Their rivalry reflected an old truth of human civilization. When resources matter, peace becomes fragile. There was also the Umojan Protectorate, more independent and often more scientifically minded, seeking its own path apart from Confederacy control. These factions, and others around them, formed a Terran political landscape that was already tense long before the Zerg or Protoss truly entered human awareness. Humanity did not need alien enemies to create conflict. It was already very good at making its own. The early history of the Koprulu Terrans includes wars, annexations, labor struggles, piracy, militarization, and political suppression. The frontier worlds were harsh places. Law could be selective. Justice often belonged to those with ships, guns, and influence. Colonial populations worked difficult lives under systems that rarely favored them. Smugglers, mercenaries, criminals, dissidents, and outlaws flourished in the margins of official power. And yet, there was also vitality in this world. Terran society was not elegant in the way of the Protoss. It did not possess the biological terror of the Zerg, but it had a raw energy all its own. This was a civilization of steel corridors, industrial ports, mining facilities, cluttered command rooms, patched hulls, and tired men and women who still kept going. The Terrans of StarCraft feel alive because they are imperfect. Their worlds are messy, their politics are cynical, their leaders lie, their soldiers complain, their colonies struggle, and still, they continue. In many ways, they are the most familiar people in the setting. Not because they are morally pure, but because they are recognizably human in all the old ways. Now, as Terran civilization expanded, one of its defining features became its reliance on military and penal systems. Among the most iconic examples of this was the use of resocialization. Resocialization was a brutal process imposed on certain criminals, dissidents, or inconvenient individuals. Rather than simply imprison them, authorities could erase or reshape parts of their minds, transforming them into obedient soldiers or workers. This is where one of the most recognizable Terran battlefield units comes from, the Marine. Not all Marines were resocialized criminals, of course, but many were. Sealed inside massive powered combat armor, carrying Gauss rifles and operating in terrifying conditions, Terran Marines were both symbols of military power and reminders of the Confederacy's cruelty. There is something haunting about them. Inside those armored suits are not shining heroes of high idealism. Often, they are broken people, manipulated people, disposable people, but they fight all the same. And that, too, is part of the Terran tragedy. Even their strength is often built from exploitation. Another defining Terran unit, the Ghost, emerged from a different side of human potential. Some humans in the Koprulu Sector possessed psionic ability. This ability was far weaker, generally speaking, than that of the Protoss, but it was real and dangerous. Human telepaths and psionics could be trained, weaponized, and transformed into covert operatives. The Ghost program took such individuals and turned them into elite agents, assassins, infiltrators, intelligence assets, and tools of state control. These ghosts were feared not only because of what they could do, but because of what had been done to them. Many were recruited young. Some were manipulated. Some were broken psychologically. And some, as we will later see, would become central to the destiny of the entire sector. Among them was one of the most important figures in all of StarCraft. A woman whose life would shape the fate of Terrans, Zerg, and Protoss alike. Sara Kerrigan. But that chapter lies ahead. For now, we are still in the age when humanity is building the stage upon which all of this will unfold. Let us slow down and look more carefully at the shape of Terran life. Imagine the colony worlds, not as shining utopias, but as places of labor, steel, dust, bureaucracy, and survival. Mining colonies beneath hard skies, cargo yards full of noise and machinery, administrative towers where officials speak of order while outer settlements go hungry, rusted bars where soldiers, pilots, and drifters trade stories under dim light, the distant hum of reactors, the hiss of pressure doors, the endless movement of freight. In StarCraft, the Terran aesthetic is deeply important. It is a future built not from ideal perfection, but from maintenance. Everything feels used. Ships are repaired and modified again and again. Armor is practical, heavy, worn. Weapons are industrial. Interfaces blink with functional urgency, not elegance. Even the great battle cruisers of the Terrans feel less like sacred marvels and more like colossal machines held together by discipline, engineering, and force of will. This gives Terran civilization a particular mood. It is not serene. It is not ancient. It is not graceful. It is tense, loud, functional, and deeply alive. And because of that, it becomes the perfect contrast to the Protoss and the Zerg. Against the Protoss, Terrans seem crude but adaptable. Against the Zerg, they seem fragile but stubborn. Between the two, they become the most unstable element in the balance of the sector. By the time the Confederacy had consolidated its power over many Terran worlds, unrest was already growing. Outer colonies felt neglected. Political dissidents opposed central control. Regional tensions simmered. Smugglers and rebels found support among those who had lost faith in Tarsonis. And in this atmosphere, another force began to take shape. A revolutionary movement, a resistance organization, a challenge to Confederacy power. This movement would become known as the Sons of Korhal. To understand them, we must understand Korhal. Korhal was a Terran world, and at one time it stood as a center of opposition to Confederacy authority. When resistance movements and anti-Confederate sentiment intensified there, the Confederacy responded not with restraint, but with overwhelming violence. In one of the darkest acts in Terran history, the Confederacy used nuclear weapons against Korhal. The planet was devastated, its cities were destroyed, its people were slaughtered, and the message was unmistakable. Rebellion would be answered with annihilation. From this horror rose a man named Arcturus Mengsk. The son of a prominent family from Korhal, Mengsk would become one of the most important and dangerous political figures in the StarCraft saga. He was intelligent, charismatic, strategic, and deeply shaped by the destruction of his home world. He did not merely oppose the Confederacy, he vowed to destroy it. Under his leadership, the Sons of Korhal became a major rebel force. They used propaganda, covert operations, military strikes, and public symbolism to undermine Confederacy legitimacy. To many, Mengsk appeared as a liberator, a man willing to do what was necessary to bring down a corrupt regime. But even early on, there was something unsettling about him, because men who believe history has chosen them often become difficult to restrain. Mengsk was not driven only by justice. He was driven by ambition, by vision, by vengeance. And those three things together can reshape worlds. At the same time, beyond all human awareness, larger forces were moving. The Zerg were expanding. The Protoss were watching. Ancient destinies were approaching collision. And the Terrans, busy with their own wars, corruptions, and rebellions, had no true understanding of what was coming. This is one of the most beautiful and tragic aspects of early StarCraft. Humanity believes its internal struggles are the center of events. The Confederacy sees rebellion, Mengsk sees revolution, the Kelmorians see resources, the Umojans see political maneuver, colonists see hardship, soldiers see orders. But above and beyond all of this, something much larger is already descending toward them. A storm from the stars, a swarm, an age-ending conflict. The Terrans are important, yes, but they are also unprepared, and that unpreparedness makes their story even more compelling. Because when the alien war truly begins, it will not meet a noble human civilization at peace. It will meet a fractured frontier species already wounded by its own history, already divided, already mistrustful, already living under systems of cruelty and control. In other words, it will meet humanity in one of its most vulnerable forms. And yet, vulnerability is not the same thing as weakness. The Terrans will prove again and again that even flawed civilizations can be astonishingly difficult to destroy. They improvise, they adapt, they endure, sometimes for noble reasons, sometimes for selfish ones, usually for both at once. As we rest for a moment within this chapter, let the picture of the Terrans settle into place. Children of exile, descendants of forgotten convicts and dissidents cast out by Earth, builders of new worlds in a distant sector, makers of corrupt governments and fierce rebellions, pilots, miners, ghosts, marines, mercenaries, smugglers, revolutionaries, a people of steel and grit, a people not chosen by destiny in any gentle way, but dragged into it all the same. And soon, very soon, the old Terran conflicts will begin to merge with something much larger. The Confederacy will face pressures it cannot fully understand. Arcturus Mengsk will rise further. Sara Kerrigan will enter the center of the story. The Protoss will intervene from the shadows. And the Zerg, the great, terrible swarm, will reveal itself to humanity for the first time. In the next part, we will move closer to the opening era of the first StarCraft war. The unrest in the colonies, Mengsk's rebellion, the introduction of Kerrigan, and the first terrifying signs that humanity is no longer alone in the sector. For now, let your mind remain here, among the colony worlds, the drifting cargo lanes, the distant battle cruisers, the harsh, flickering lights of the Terran frontier, and the long human story of exile that carried itself, unknowingly, toward the edge of cosmic war. And now, let us continue. The ancient designs of the Xel'Naga still linger behind everything. The rise of the Protoss still glows in the far distance. The long Terran exile still echoes through steel corridors and colony dust. But now, the story begins to narrow. Now, the grand movements of history start to take human shape, no longer only worlds and civilizations. Now we begin to meet the people who will carry this story forward. We move toward the opening age of the first great conflict, toward restless frontier colonies, toward rebellion, toward betrayal, toward first contact with horrors no human mind was prepared to understand. And we begin on a world called Mar Sara. Mar Sara was not the center of civilization. It was not Tarsonis, the shining capital of Confederacy power. It was not Moria, rich with industry. It was not some legendary world draped in old prestige. It was a colony world, a hard place, a frontier place, a place of dust, labor, tension, and distance. Like many Terran colonies, Mar Sara lived under the shadow of larger powers. The Confederacy ruled from far away, but its authority reached even into places like this, where local life was shaped by economic pressure, bureaucracy, and the quiet frustration of people who knew very well that they mattered less than the worlds at the center. In these outer colonies, law and order had a different feeling. They were real, yes, but they were thin, localized, practical, often dependent on a few officials, marshals, militia personnel, and commanders trying to keep something working at the edge of a political system that did not care enough to understand the realities on the ground. And it is here that we meet one of the defining figures of the StarCraft universe, Jim Raynor. James Eugene Raynor did not begin as a great galactic hero. He did not arrive with prophecy around him. He was, in many ways, exactly the kind of man frontier history produces. A soldier once, a lawman after that, a man who had seen enough of authority to mistrust it, but not enough suffering to stop caring about ordinary people. Raynor had once served in the Confederate military, and like many Terrans shaped by experience, he had seen the machinery of power from the inside. Later, he became a marshal on Mar Sara, trying to maintain order in a world already sliding toward unrest. There is something deeply human about Raynor. He is not polished. He is not mystical. He is not grand in the way of kings or prophets. He is tired, practical, strong-willed, and often skeptical. He carries the atmosphere of a man who has spent too much time watching institutions fail the people they claim to protect. And yet, he has not become empty. That matters, because in StarCraft, many characters become hardened. But Raynor never fully stops believing that people matter, and in a brutal universe, that becomes one of the rarest things of all. At this time, the Koprulu Sector was restless. The Confederacy was still powerful, but cracks had widened, rebellion stirred, outer colonies were unstable. The sons of Korhal, under Arcturus Mengsk, were growing bolder. Propaganda, covert action, raids, and political pressure were creating a sense that the old order could not last forever. Sara, like many colonies, sat inside this tension. Confederate officials tried to maintain control. Colonists lived their difficult lives. Rumors spread. Ships came and went. And somewhere beyond the edges of human understanding, the first movements of the Zerg had already begun. But humanity did not yet know this. Not fully. At first, what appeared were small signs. Disturbances, disappearances, attacks difficult to explain, whispers of hostile organisms unlike anything Terran forces had seen before. There is always something chilling about the first contact with the unknown, not when a civilization knows it faces another intelligence. That can still be framed politically, militarily, strategically. The true horror comes earlier. It comes in the stage where no one understands what they are looking at, where reports sound impossible, where outposts fall in strange ways, where bodies, structures, and signals no longer make sense. On Sara, the first Zerg encounters emerged in exactly this atmosphere. These creatures were not like Terran soldiers. They were not like pirates. They were not like rival militias or insurgent groups. They were biological weapons and living predators combined into one relentless force. Fast, ferocious, alien in body and purpose. The earliest Zerg seen by Terrans inspired immediate fear because they violated familiar categories. They were neither beasts in the ordinary sense nor soldiers in the human sense. They were organized, violent, adaptive life forms that seemed designed for invasion at a biological level. The colony was not ready. And the Confederacy, even when it became aware that something serious was happening, did not respond with clarity or honesty. This is crucial, because one of the defining themes of early StarCraft is not merely that the aliens arrive. It is that the human government tries to manage the truth, to control it, to conceal it, to weaponize it. Rather than openly protect the colonies, the Confederacy often acted with secrecy, preserving its own interests and information systems even as frontier worlds descended into danger. This deepened the distrust already present in men like Raynor. As the Zerg threat on Sara became more visible, Raynor found himself increasingly at odds with Confederate authority. He saw confusion, incompetence, and moral failure. He saw ordinary colonists caught in events far beyond their control. And he saw the familiar Terran pattern repeating, power protecting itself first. The conflict escalated. Raynor disobeyed Confederate orders. For this, he was arrested. And this moment matters more than it first appears, because this is the moment where Raynor's old identity, lawman within a corrupt system, begins to break apart. He had tried to work inside the structure. He had tried to maintain order. But now the structure itself was becoming part of the problem. And into this moment stepped Arcturus Mengsk. Mengsk and the sons of Korhal arrived not simply as rebels with guns, but as a new political possibility. To those disillusioned with the Confederacy, Mengsk could appear as the future. Decisive, bold, revolutionary, willing to expose truth and strike back against an old regime built on lies and cruelty. Mengsk freed Raynor, and Raynor, with nowhere meaningful left inside the Confederate order, joined him. This was not a simple act of ideological conversion. Raynor was not naive. He did not become blind to Mengsk's ambition. But in that moment, the Confederacy had shown itself unwilling or unable to do what needed to be done. Mengsk, for all his danger, was at least moving. And in times of crisis, motion often looks like hope. Thus Raynor became associated with the Sons of Korhal, entering the orbit of one of the most consequential men in the galaxy. But Mengsk did not stand alone. At his side was another figure of enormous importance, a woman feared, respected, and already touched by the hidden machinery of power, Sara Kerrigan. To understand the early StarCraft story, one must understand how Kerrigan appears at first. She is not yet the Queen of Blades. She is not yet the nightmare of Char. She is not yet the transformed embodiment of Zerg will. At this stage, she is human. But even then, she is extraordinary. Kerrigan was a ghost, one of the Confederacy's psionic operatives. As we mentioned earlier, ghosts were trained and exploited as covert instruments, assassins, infiltrators, intelligence tools, and living weapons. Kerrigan was among the most gifted of them all. Her psionic abilities were exceptional. Her combat capability was exceptional. Her usefulness to political power was exceptional. And like many such people in StarCraft, her life had already been shaped by manipulation long before she entered the main war. As a child, Kerrigan had powerful psionic potential. This made her valuable and dangerous in the eyes of Terran authorities. Her training under Confederate control was severe. The Ghost program was not a gentle institution. It did not care much for innocence. It turned talent into an instrument. Kerrigan became deadly, efficient, precise. But beneath that precision lived a person who had been used by systems far older and colder than any ordinary battlefield command. Eventually, Kerrigan broke with the Confederacy and aligned with Mengsk. For him, she was invaluable, an elite operative, fiercely intelligent, capable of infiltration and assassination, and politically symbolic as someone who had once belonged to the enemy's apparatus. For Kerrigan herself, Mengsk may have represented something complicated, perhaps liberation, perhaps purpose, perhaps simply a new master less openly false than the old one. At first, she and Raynor did not mirror one another. They were different in temperament and history. Raynor was rough, grounded, skeptical, with a moral instinct that survived disappointment. Kerrigan was controlled, sharp, trained by secrecy and trauma, carrying a hardness that came from being molded into a weapon. And yet, there was a certain tension between them from the beginning, not only personal, but thematic. Raynor represented conscience struggling to remain alive in a corrupt universe. Kerrigan represented power shaped by that corruption. Their relationship, in time, would become one of the most important emotional threads in the entire StarCraft saga. But in these early moments, the immediate concern was survival. Sara was worsening. The Zerg threat was real. And as events intensified, another power entered the scene: the Protoss. To Terran eyes, the arrival of Protoss forces was both astonishing and terrifying. These were beings of advanced technology, disciplined presence, and immense power. Their ships, their weapons, their aura, everything about them suggested something far beyond anything Terran civilization had known. But the Protoss did not arrive as diplomats. They arrived as executioners. When the Protoss detected Zerg infestation on Terran worlds, they acted according to their own strategic logic. The Zerg, left unchecked, represented catastrophic danger, and worlds already compromised by Zerg presence could become footholds for swarm expansion. So, the Protoss cleansed them. Orbital bombardment, planetary incineration, entire areas reduced to ash in order to contain infestation. To the Protoss, this was grim necessity. To the Terrans, it looked like indiscriminate destruction. This misunderstanding is one of the great tragedies of early StarCraft. The Protoss were not simply murdering humans for pleasure. They were trying, in their severe and ancient way, to prevent something even worse. But they did not explain themselves in any way the Terrans could accept. And so to human colonists, the universe suddenly seemed full of monsters and gods alike. First the Zerg, a devouring biological horror, and then the Protoss, luminous destroyers arriving from the sky to burn entire worlds. For Sara, this meant doom. The colony could not remain. Evacuation became necessary, and here we begin to see another element of Mengsk's style. He was bold, opportunistic, and deeply willing to use crisis for political gain. Mengsk understood that the Zerg threat, terrifying as it was, could also be turned into a weapon against the Confederacy. He understood media, symbolism, momentum. He knew that in a collapsing order, the man who appears decisive can seize history. This is where one of the most unsettling Terran technologies enters the story more clearly: the psi emitter. A psi emitter was a device capable of attracting the Zerg. This was not simply a scanner or lure in the ordinary sense. It was a strategic horror, a machine that could draw the swarm toward a chosen location, effectively turning the Zerg into a weapon of indirect annihilation. And Mengsk, seeing an opportunity, was willing to use it. This is an essential truth about him. He does not merely resist evil, he instrumentalizes danger. He believes ends justify means. He believes history forgives victory. And this, even before his worst actions, already marks him as a profoundly dangerous man. For Raynor, these developments were troubling. He could oppose the Confederacy and still feel unease around Mengsk. He could recognize corruption in one power and begin to sense a different kind of corruption in another. That is one of the reasons Raynor matters so much as a character. He notices the moral temperature of events. He feels when something is wrong, even before he can fully articulate it. Kerrigan, meanwhile, remained effective, loyal in operational terms, and deeply engaged in Mengsk's campaigns. She carried out missions. She fought. She helped drive the rebellion forward. And all the while, the galaxy drew tighter around them. Let us pause here for a moment and picture the emotional landscape of this era. Sara under strain, civil order unraveling, dusty settlements under alien threat, Confederate authority growing hollow, Raynor stepping away from the system he once served, Mengsk rising as revolutionary and manipulator, Kerrigan moving through command structures like a sharpened blade, the Protoss striking from above in terrible silence. And somewhere beyond all this confusion, the Overmind's attention deepening. What makes early StarCraft so compelling is that no one fully understands the whole picture. Not Raynor, not Mengsk, not Kerrigan, not the frightened colonists. Even the Protoss, with all their ancient knowledge, do not yet fully control the shape of what is coming. Everyone is reacting to fragments, to emergencies, to partial truths, to immediate survival. And that creates a feeling of tension that never really leaves the setting. The universe is too large, the forces are too old, the motives are too hidden. By the end of the Sara crisis, the old Terran world had already begun to crack. What was once a frontier problem was becoming a sector-wide revelation. Aliens were real. The Confederacy was compromised. The rebellion had momentum. and new powers were stepping openly onto the stage. This was no longer just a colonial disturbance. This was the beginning of galactic war. Soon, the conflict would move toward Antiga Prime, Tarsonis, and the full collapse of the old order. Mengsk would make choices that could never be forgiven. Kerrigan would move closer to the turning point that would transform her forever. Raynor's loyalty would be tested in ways that would define his life. And the Zerg, no longer a rumor at the edge, would descend in force. In the next part, we will follow the rebellion further, to Antiga Prime, to escalating conflict with the Confederacy, to the increasing use of PSI emitters, and to the terrible path leading toward Tarsonis, where one of the greatest betrayals in all of StarCraft will unfold. For now, rest here, on the edge of first contact, beneath the dim skies of a threatened colony, where men and women still speak in human terms of politics and rebellion, not yet realizing that they have already stepped into a story far older, darker, and more merciless than anything their species was prepared to endure. And now, let us continue. The dust of Sara has not yet settled. The first contact with the Zerg has already torn open the old assumptions of Terran life. The Protoss have entered the story like distant gods of fire and judgment. Jim Raynor has stepped away from the authority he once tried to serve. Sara Kerrigan has moved deeper into the machinery of rebellion. And Arcturus Mengsk, patient and dangerous, is no longer merely a dissident voice in the shadows. He is becoming something larger, a challenger to power, a maker of events, a man already beginning to reshape the sector in his own image. From Sara, the conflict spread outward, and one of the next major stages of this growing crisis was Antiga Prime. Antiga Prime was a world of agriculture, open land, and human life shaped not by the dense metallic pressure of industrial capitals, but by the rhythms of production, settlement, and colonial continuity. Yet like so many Terran worlds, it existed beneath the weight of Confederacy politics. The people there were not removed from the wider unrest of the Koprulu Sector. They felt it. They lived inside it. And by this time, anti-Confederate sentiment was no longer unusual. It was spreading. The Confederacy had ruled through force, control, secrecy, and selective cruelty for too long. Outer worlds had suffered. Dissidents had been silenced. Korhal had been burned. And the appearance of the Zerg only exposed more clearly what many already suspected. The old order was not simply unjust, it was brittle, it was failing. On Antiga Prime, resistance to the Confederacy was strong enough that Mengsk saw strategic opportunity there. The Sons of Korhal moved to support local anti-Confederate forces, and in doing so, they expanded both their influence and their symbolic role. No longer just raiders or insurgents, they increasingly looked like the spearhead of a new political order. To many in the sector, this was hopeful. To others, it was frightening. Because revolution always carries two faces. One face is liberation, the other is ambition. And Mengsk always carried both. For Jim Raynor, this stage of the rebellion brought increasing complexity. He had already broken with Confederate authority. He had already seen enough dishonesty and cowardice from the old regime to know it deserved opposition. But as operations continued, he also began to see how Mengsk functioned at a deeper level. Mengsk was intelligent, undeniably. He understood movement. He understood symbols, media, timing, morale, and fear. He knew how to frame a battle not just as a tactical event, but as a narrative victory. He knew how to appear as the inevitable answer to a broken age. And men like that are often more dangerous than open tyrants, because they do not begin by looking like tyrants. They begin by looking necessary. Meanwhile, Kerrigan remained central to Mengsk's efforts. She was one of his most effective operatives, carrying out missions that required precision, infiltration, and force. On Antiga Prime, as in earlier operations, her presence represented both practical strength and something more symbolic. The Confederacy's own weapon now turned against it. Kerrigan's relationship with the rebellion was always layered. She was not a simple believer. She was not naive. But she was capable, purposeful, and moving along a path whose emotional and moral end she could not yet see. There is something deeply tragic in that. In StarCraft, many disasters begin not because someone is foolish, but because they are effective within a system whose direction is already wrong. As the struggle on Antiga Prime intensified, the Zerg threat also remained close. This mattered enormously, because Mengsk had already begun using PSI emitters in his campaign strategy. These devices, capable of drawing the Zerg toward selected locations, were not merely tactical tools. They were instruments of catastrophic manipulation. To use a PSI emitter was to invite infestation, to summon the swarm, to turn an alien horror into a weapon against one's enemies. Mengsk was willing to do this because he believed in outcomes over principles. If the Confederacy could be weakened, if panic could be caused, if strategic advantage could be gained, then the suffering unleashed along the way could be rationalized. He was not the kind of man to hesitate long at the edge of moral disaster. He was the kind of man who stepped forward and named it necessity. This is where Raynor's discomfort deepened. He could fight against the Confederacy. He could stand with colonists. He could resist corruption. But the use of Zerg lures, the willingness to expose worlds and populations to infestation, crossed into something darker. Raynor began to see that Mengsk's war was not only against tyranny, it was also a ladder Mengsk intended to climb, even if others were crushed beneath it. At the same time, the Protoss continued to intervene where Zerg presence spread. Their methods remained severe and difficult for Terrans to understand. Worlds touched by infestation risked becoming nodes of wider swarm expansion, and the Protoss acted according to a logic shaped by ancient experience and terrible responsibility. Yet that logic did not translate into human terms. The Protoss did not arrive with soft explanations. They arrived with overwhelming power. And so to many Terrans, the universe still seemed divided between two alien nightmares, one that consumed from below and one that burned from above. Within this atmosphere of fear, confusion, and rebellion, Mengsk's cause gained momentum. The Confederacy, though still formidable, was growing more visibly unstable. Its failures could no longer be hidden as easily. Frontier worlds knew they were vulnerable. News of alien attacks spread. Rebellion spread with it. The old regime had spent too long maintaining power through suppression, and suppression had left it unable to inspire loyalty when the crisis truly came. There is an old weakness in such systems. They can command obedience. They can buy silence. They can instill fear. But when catastrophe arrives, fear does not create devotion. It creates collapse. And the Confederacy was moving toward collapse. The path from Antiga Prime led inevitably toward the sector's political heart, toward Tarsonis. Tarsonis was more than a capital. It was the symbolic center of Confederate civilization. Wealth, governance, prestige, bureaucracy, and elite security all converged there. For the Confederacy, Tarsonis was proof of order, proof of endurance, proof that its rule represented civilization itself. But symbols are fragile, and when a symbol falls, it does not fall alone. It takes an age with it. Before we arrive at Tarsonis fully, Let us slow down and understand the emotional weight of the moment. The old order is cracking. Mengsk is rising. Raynor is growing uneasy. Kerrigan remains at the center of operations, still moving with lethal clarity. The Zerg are no longer rumor, but active terror. The Protoss continue their severe interventions, and the galaxy, though not yet aware of every ancient force behind events, is already bending toward one of its greatest turning points. When Mengsk chose to strike at Tarsonis, he did not do so only as a military calculation. He did it as theater, as destiny, as revolution rendered visible. To attack the capital was to announce that the Confederacy could bleed. To endanger the capital was to expose its weakness. To break the capital was to end the illusion that history still belonged to the old regime. And so Mengsk made one of the most infamous decisions in all of Terran history. He deployed PSI emitters on Tarsonis. Let that settle for a moment. Not on an isolated battlefield, not on some abandoned installation, on the capital world, a populated world, a world full of civilians, infrastructure, government personnel, families, laborers, officials, and all the ordinary lives that continue even inside corrupt systems. He summoned the Zerg to Tarsonis. This was not collateral damage. This was not unintended consequence. This was a deliberate invitation of apocalypse, and it worked. The Zerg came. They descended upon Tarsonis in force, overwhelming Confederate defenses and throwing the capital into chaos. The old state, for all its power, could not withstand the scale and ferocity of the swarm once fully drawn in. Panic spread. Systems failed. Authority shattered. What had once been the secure center of Terran rule became a collapsing world under alien assault. This is one of the great moments of StarCraft because it reveals so much at once. It reveals the fragility of the Confederacy. It reveals Mengsk's ruthless ambition. It reveals the moral cost of revolutionary myth. It reveals how little ordinary lives matter to those who seek history by force. And it reveals the terrifying practicality of the Zerg, because once summoned, they do what they always do. They swarm, they consume, they overwhelm. There is no negotiation in them, no pity, no pause. For Kerrigan, the assault on Tarsonis marked the beginning of the path that would define her fate forever. Mengsk sent her into increasingly dangerous operations during this stage of the campaign, using her skill where the conflict was most intense. Kerrigan, as always, performed with exceptional competence. She fought through impossible situations. She remained one of the most effective people in his orbit. But the conditions around Tarsonis were changing rapidly. The Zerg pressure was immense. The chaos was widening. And Mengsk's decisions were moving from ruthless into unforgivable. For Raynor, Tarsonis became a moral breaking point. Whatever uncertainty he had carried earlier about Mengsk's methods now sharpened into something far clearer. This was no longer rebellion with hard compromises. This was monstrous calculation. Tarsonis was being sacrificed, not just the Confederacy, the people. And this distinction matters deeply, because StarCraft is full of political struggle, but its emotional power often rests on a simpler question. When systems fail, who still sees the human beings inside them? Raynor does. That is why he cannot follow Mengsk all the way. Mengsk sees states, power, victory, legitimacy, fear. Raynor sees people trapped in the machinery. That is why the two men, though temporarily aligned against the Confederacy, were never walking the same road. On Tarsonis, this difference became undeniable, and then came the betrayal. During the assault, Kerrigan was assigned to hold a position and support operations amid the chaos of the Zerg invasion. As the situation deteriorated, it became clear that the area was becoming untenable. The danger was overwhelming, Retreat and extraction became urgent. Raynor urged that Kerrigan be rescued. Mengsk refused. That refusal is among the coldest moments in the early saga. Kerrigan, who had served him with loyalty and deadly effectiveness, who had carried out his missions, who had helped bring him to the edge of triumph, was abandoned. Not by accident, not because there was no time to think, but because Mengsk made a choice. He judged her expendable, or perhaps strategically inconvenient, or perhaps useful, even in abandonment, to a future calculation he alone could justify. Whatever exact reasoning moved behind his eyes, the fact remains, he left her to the Zerg. Raynor was horrified, and rightly so. This was not merely a political betrayal. It was a human one. Kerrigan, already shaped by systems that had used her as a weapon, was now discarded by yet another powerful man when it served his ascent. There is a terrible pattern in her life, and Tarsonis seals it. Used, directed, valued for power, abandoned at the edge of transformation. For Mengsk, however, the immediate outcome was triumph. The Confederacy fell. Tarsonis was broken. The old Terran order collapsed, and from its ruins, Mengsk declared the birth of a new regime, the Terran Dominion. Consider how chilling this is in its elegance. He defeats a corrupt state not by rejecting its deeper logic, but by inheriting and refining it. He becomes emperor. He wraps conquest in renewal. He presents himself as the answer to the horror he helped unleash. This is one of the great political ironies of StarCraft. The Confederacy dies, but tyranny does not. It changes voice. It changes banner. It changes style. And many people, desperate for stability after catastrophe, accept it. Because after terror, even controlled power can feel like relief. Meanwhile, Kerrigan did not die on Tarsonis. That would have been almost merciful. Instead, she was taken by the Zerg, captured, infested, transformed. The exact biological and psionic processes involved were beyond ordinary Terran understanding, but the result would become one of the most famous metamorphoses in science fiction gaming history. Sara Kerrigan, human ghost and political operative, would become something new, something terrible, something neither fully human nor simply Zerg. But that full transformation belongs to the next chapter. For now, we remain at the edge of it, at the moment when abandonment becomes fate, at the moment when a world falls, a regime rises, and a woman disappears into the machinery of the swarm. Let us rest there a moment and picture Tarsonis in its final hours. Cities under attack, the sky alive with fire, Zerg forces pouring through defenses, Confederate authority collapsing, Mengsk aboard his command vessel, watching history bend, Raynor furious and powerless to stop what has happened, Kerrigan cut off, fighting in vain against impossible odds, the Protoss moving through the wider conflict, trying in their own severe way to contain disaster. And beneath it all, deeper than anyone present fully knows, the old currents of Xel'Naga design and Amon's corruption still guiding destiny toward darker forms. Tarsonis is not just the fall of a capital, it is the end of innocence for the Terran story. From here forward, no one can pretend this war is merely political. No one can pretend power can be handled cleanly. No one can pretend that victory leaves the soul untouched. In the next part, we will follow what comes after Tarsonis, the rise of the Terran Dominion, Raynor's break from Mengsk, the Zerg transformation of Kerrigan, the awakening of the Queen of Blades, and the growing response of the Protoss as the war expands beyond all human control. For now, let the fires of Tarsonis fade into the distance. Let the broken capital drift into silence, and let the terrible shape of this age become clear. A corrupt empire has fallen. a new one has risen, and in the ashes between them, something far more dangerous than either has been born. And now, let us continue. Tarsonis has fallen behind us, though its fire still seems to glow in the imagination. The Confederacy is broken. Arcturus Mengsk rises from its ruins and names himself the architect of a new order. Jim Raynor, who once hoped rebellion might still contain some moral center, has seen the truth too clearly to remain blind. And Sara Kerrigan, abandoned amid the chaos of Zerg invasion, has disappeared into something far worse than death. The story is changing again. What began as political unrest in the Terran colonies has become a galactic catastrophe. And at the heart of that catastrophe, one human life is being remade. To understand the emotional power of StarCraft, one must pause here, in the aftermath of Tarsonis, and feel the weight of betrayal. Kerrigan had been many things already: a child shaped by fear, a prodigy marked by psionic power, a ghost trained by systems that turned gifted human beings into weapons, an operative used by the Confederacy, a rebel used by Mengsk. Again and again, she had been valued not simply as a person, but as an instrument, useful, effective, dangerous. And now, in the wake of Tarsonis, she was no longer in human hands at all. She had been taken by the Zerg. For most Terrans, this alone would have implied only horror. The Zerg did not capture in the way humans captured. They consumed. They infested. They broke biological boundaries and rebuilt them according to the logic of the swarm, where human war still leaves room, at least in theory, for imprisonment, rescue, negotiation, or escape. The Zerg represent something more absolute. To fall into their grasp is to risk losing the self entirely. And yet Kerrigan was not simply devoured. She was transformed. The Overmind, vast intelligence at the center of the swarm, had recognized something extraordinary in her. Kerrigan's psionic power, her will, her mental strength, and the intensity of her human identity made her uniquely valuable. She was not merely suitable as biomass. She was suitable as synthesis. This is where the oldest themes of StarCraft begin to echo again in a new and terrible way. The Zerg, embodiment of purity of form, had long been driven towards stronger integration with psionic force. The Protoss were one path toward that, but now here stood a human, lesser in psionic potential than a Protoss perhaps, but still rare, still powerful, still available. Kerrigan became a bridge, a convergence, a weapon the Overmind could elevate into something more focused, more adaptable, more precise than the brute organisms of the swarm. And so, the infestation began. The details of that transformation have always carried an eerie power in the imagination. We do not need to dwell on them harshly to understand their meaning. The Zerg did not simply alter Kerrigan's body. They reached into identity itself. Flesh was remade. Psionic strength was amplified. Human form was reshaped into something elegant, alien, and terrifying. Yet what makes Kerrigan's transformation so unforgettable is that she does not emerge as a mindless creature. She emerges with mind intact, or perhaps more precisely, with mind sharpened by pain, rage, and new perception. She becomes something that remembers, and remembered suffering, when fused with power, can become more dangerous than instinct. When Kerrigan emerged from Zerg transformation, the galaxy gained one of its most iconic figures, the Queen of Blades. Even the name carries mythic force. It is not bureaucratic, not technical. It sounds like prophecy made flesh. The Queen of Blades was no longer merely Sara Kerrigan in any ordinary human sense. She was Zerg and human intertwined, biological terror guided by intelligence, emotion, cunning, and psionic force. She could command swarms, strategize like a commander, perceive with alien sharpness, and project an aura of fear unlike anything Terran or Protoss had yet faced. And still, within her, the memory of betrayal remained. That matters deeply, because Kerrigan's Zerg transformation did not erase history, it weaponized it. The Queen of Blades is frightening not only because she is powerful, but because she is personal. The swarm gains not just a commander, but a consciousness shaped by human abandonment, human manipulation, and human fury. Her vengeance is not abstract. It has names, it has faces, it has a past, and one of those faces is Arcturus Mengsk. Meanwhile, in the Terran sphere, Mengsk moved quickly to consolidate his triumph. Out of the ruins of the Confederacy, he founded the Terran Dominion, presenting it as a new beginning, a stronger and more legitimate human order. To populations exhausted by war, chaos, and the collapse of familiar institutions, this promise had obvious appeal. That is often how empires are born, not always through celebration, but through exhaustion. People reach a point where even harsh order feels easier to bear than total instability. Mengsk understood this very well. He had always understood power as theater as much as force. He did not merely seize control. He framed himself as the necessary answer to catastrophe. He made use of symbolism, rhetoric, military certainty, and political inevitability. He looked like the man history had selected. But men who look selected by history are often the ones most willing to rewrite morality in its name. Raynor could not accept this. Whatever his flaws, whatever his roughness, whatever anger and grief he carried, he could not remain aligned with a man who had sacrificed Tarsonis and abandoned Kerrigan. The line had been crossed too clearly, and so Raynor broke with Mengsk. This was more than a personal disagreement. It was the collapse of a temporary alliance built on shared opposition to the Confederacy, but not on shared values. Raynor had hoped, perhaps not consciously, but sincerely, that rebellion might still mean justice. Mengsk had shown that for him, rebellion meant acquisition. Raynor's departure is one of the central moral turns in the saga. He loses the political shelter of the winning side. He steps away from power. He becomes, once again, a man in the outer dark, standing not with certainty, but with conscience. This makes him vulnerable. It also makes him real. There are many kinds of strength in StarCraft. Protoss strength is disciplined, luminous, ancient. Zerg strength is adaptive, predatory, overwhelming. Mengsk's strength is political and manipulative, but Raynor's strength is something quieter, the refusal to become what the universe seems to reward. That refusal costs him dearly. It will continue to cost him for years. And yet, it is precisely why he matters. As Raynor separated from Mengsk's dominion, the larger war only widened. The Protoss, too, were moving under increasing strain. To them, the rise of the Queen of Blades and the continuing spread of the Zerg represented existential danger. Protoss leaders had already faced the impossible burden of containing infestation through severe measures. Now, the swarm had become even more dangerous, guided not only by the Overmind's vast will, but also by a cunning, targeted, ruthless intelligence in Kerrigan. Among the Protoss, one of the key figures in this era was Tassadar. Tassadar is one of the most important Protoss characters because he stands at the intersection of duty, spiritual depth, and heresy. He is a commander, but also a thinker, a servant of Protoss civilization, but also one capable of questioning it. In a setting filled with rigid structures, Tassadar brings something different, a willingness to seek truth even when truth threatens doctrine. This matters because the Protoss were themselves internally divided. Their civilization was ancient and magnificent, but not untroubled. The Khala had given them unity, yes, but unity can become orthodoxy. Orthodoxy can become rigidity, and rigidity can make adaptation difficult even for the wise. As the war escalated, Tassadar came to understand that old Protoss methods might not be enough. The Zerg threat was not simply military, it was spiritual, biological, and historical all at once. And somewhere in that understanding lay the path that would eventually bring him into contact with the Dark Templar, those Protoss exiles who had rejected the Khala long ago. But that chapter is still ahead. For now, what matters is that while humanity struggled under new tyranny and Kerrigan rose within the swarm, the Protoss were also being forced to reconsider everything they believed about survival. The beauty of StarCraft is that each faction contains its own tragedy. The Terrans are flawed, divided, and politically corrupt. The Protoss are ancient, noble, but burdened by dogma and old wounds. The Zerg are terrifying, yet they too are shaped by deeper manipulation, reaching back to the corruption of the Xel'Naga legacy. No one stands outside suffering. No one arrives untouched. And as Kerrigan established herself as the Queen of Blades, her presence altered the emotional balance of the entire story. Before her transformation, the Zerg were terrifying because they were vast. After her transformation, they became terrifying because they were intimate. The swarm now had a face, a voice, a center of personality. Kerrigan was not merely a beast. She could taunt, plan, deceive, and remember. She could project intelligence through horror. That combination is unforgettable. It is one thing to fear an animal storm. It is another to fear a mind looking back at you from inside it. For Raynor, the news of Kerrigan's transformation was devastating in ways difficult to measure. There is grief in losing someone to death. There is a different kind of grief in losing someone to change so complete that memory itself becomes painful. Kerrigan had not simply died on Tarsonis. She had been turned into the enemy. And yet, because this is StarCraft, even that phrase remains unstable. Was she the enemy? Yes. Was she still Sara Kerrigan? In some way, yes. Could she be separated from what had been done to her? No simple answer ever fully holds. That ambiguity is part of why her story endures. She is neither innocent victim nor simple villain. She is violated, empowered, wrathful, brilliant, and increasingly self-directed. Once transformed, she does not merely obey. She begins to become herself anew. That is perhaps the most unsettling part of all. Let us linger for a moment in the atmosphere of this age. The Dominion rises on human worlds. Its banners replace those of the Confederacy, but fear remains beneath political language. Raynor moves into resistance and uncertainty. Protoss fleets continue their grim war. The swarm expands, and at the center of the Zerg, upon the volcanic desolation of Char, Kerrigan awakens into new identity. Char is a fitting world for such a rebirth. Harsh, burning, hostile, a place where heat and ruin seem woven into the ground itself. There is almost a ritual quality to it, as though the universe has chosen a furnace for the making of something dark and sovereign. Here, the Queen of Blades takes shape not only in body, but in myth. Stories like this always depend on atmosphere, and StarCraft understands that well. Kerrigan on Char is not just a character on a planet. She is an image, silhouette and wings, psionic power and alien grace, the memory of humanity standing inside monstrous transformation. The image alone could carry a legend, and legends, once formed, begin to change how everyone else acts. The Dominion fears her. Raynor cannot forget her. The Protoss recognize the scale of the threat she represents. The swarm responds to her. The galaxy reorganizes around her presence, yet it is important not to move too quickly. At this stage, the Overmind still stands above the swarm's total structure. Kerrigan is powerful, but not yet supreme over all Zerg. She is elevated, central, feared, yes, but the hierarchy of the swarm still includes deeper controlling forces. This means the next phase of the war will not only be a struggle between species, it will also be a struggle around command, destiny, and the hidden vulnerabilities of the Zerg itself. And this brings us back, gently, to the Protoss. Because if the Terrans are reeling and the Zerg are transforming, the Protoss are approaching a revelation of their own. The usual military methods are proving insufficient. Ancient certainty is being challenged, and Tassadar, moving toward truths forbidden by Orthodox society, is preparing to take steps that may save his people at immense personal cost. In the next part, we will move toward the Protoss campaign in greater depth, Tassadar, the Conclave, the growing role of the Dark Templar, the secret of how the Zerg can truly be fought, and the road toward the confrontation with the Overmind itself. For now, rest here, in the long shadow after Tarsonis, with the Dominion rising from political ash, with Raynor turning away from false victory, with the swarm breathing across burning worlds, and with Sara Kerrigan no longer lost, but changed, not erased, not silenced, but reborn as something the galaxy will never forget. And now, let us continue. The galaxy has grown darker. The old Terran order has died and been replaced by the Dominion. Jim Raynor has stepped away from power rather than surrender his conscience. Sara Kerrigan has been transformed into the Queen of Blades, and the Zerg now feel more intimate, more cunning, and more terrifying than ever before. But while humanity struggles to survive and the swarm expands across burning worlds, another great civilization is facing a crisis of its own, the Protoss. To Terran eyes, the Protoss often seem almost perfect. They arrive in gleaming ships. They move with discipline and purpose. Their technology feels elegant, impossible, and ancient. Their warriors project nobility, silence, and overwhelming power. But perfection in StarCraft is always an illusion. The Protoss are wise, but not free of fear. Ancient, but not free of error. United, but not without division. And in this chapter of the story, their hidden fractures begin to matter more than ever. At the center of this part of the tale stands Tassadar. Tassadar is one of the most quietly powerful characters in StarCraft because he does not dominate the story through cruelty, charisma, or brute force. He matters because he changes. He listens. He questions. He allows experience to reshape belief. In worlds governed by rigid certainty, such people are rare, and among the Protoss, they are dangerous. Tassadar served as a high-ranking Protoss commander during the Zerg crisis. He was entrusted with enormous responsibility, especially as the threat to Protoss worlds and interests grew more severe. The Zerg were not merely another enemy force. They were corruption made biological. They spread, adapted, consumed, and multiplied. Left unchecked, they could turn entire worlds into foundations for further horror. The Protoss understood this better than the Terrans did. They had ancient reasons for fearing the swarm. They knew, even if not all truths were fully visible, that the Zerg represented something tied to the oldest and darkest history of the galaxy, and so the Protoss had acted with extreme severity. When Zerg infestation appeared on worlds such as Sara and Sara, Protoss fleets cleansed them from orbit. To human witnesses, this seemed monstrous, but to Protoss command, it was necessity. Better to burn part of a world than allow the swarm to spread beyond control. This logic, harsh as it was, emerged from responsibility and fear. But even within Protoss society, fear can harden into doctrine, and doctrine can become blindness. The ruling body of the Protoss at this time was the Conclave. The Conclave was not merely a government in the simple Terran sense. It was an ancient leadership structure, steeped in tradition, spiritual authority, social hierarchy, and the legitimacy of long continuity. It represented order. It represented orthodoxy. It represented the formal mind of Protoss civilization. And like many ancient ruling structures, it believed deeply in its own ability to interpret the world correctly. That belief would become a problem. At first, Tassadar carried out his duties within the expectations of his people. He fought the Zerg. He obeyed command. He acted as a defender of Aiur and Protoss order. But the war was unlike anything simple obedience could contain. The more Tassadar encountered the Zerg, the more he began to sense that conventional Protoss methods might not be enough. That realization matters, because civilizations often collapse not when they lack strength, but when they cannot recognize that their old strength no longer answers new danger. The Protoss had power beyond Terran imagination. Their fleets were magnificent. Their warriors were among the deadliest in the galaxy. Their psionic unity through the Khala gave them coordination and depth of shared being that humanity could barely comprehend. And still, something was missing. The Zerg could be fought. They could be burned. They could be pushed back. But they were difficult to truly destroy at the deepest level. Again and again, the swarm returned, adapted, and persisted. Tassadar's journey would eventually lead him toward a truth the Conclave did not want to face. To understand that truth, we must return to one of the old fractures in Protoss history. Long ago, as we mentioned earlier, the Protoss embraced the Khala, a shared psionic path that brought unity, harmony, and social order after ages of division. Through the Khala, Protoss minds became connected in a profound communal structure. This transformed their civilization, allowing them to overcome internal chaos and rise into a golden age. But not all Protoss accepted the Khala. Some refused the surrender of private mental sovereignty. Some distrusted such unity. Some remained loyal to older ways. These dissenters were eventually exiled from Aiur. They became known as the Dark Templar, or the Nerazim. To mainstream Protoss society, especially under the authority of the Conclave, the Dark Templar were more than dissidents. They were taboo, a spiritual and historical danger. A people separated from the Khala, and therefore separated, in the eyes of orthodox Protoss thought, from the rightful path of civilization itself. But exile has strange effects on a people. It can destroy them, or it can transform them into something different, something outsiders no longer understand. The Dark Templar, in exile, developed their own disciplines. Having rejected the Khala, they cultivated another relationship with psionic force, not the shared current of communal unity, but the hidden currents of the void. This distinction is crucial. If the Khala represents harmony, structure, and open psionic communion, the void represents silence, secrecy, shadow, and a different depth of power. The Dark Templar became masters of this way. They moved unseen. They fought with terrifying precision. They embodied a kind of stillness, an inward strength alien even to other Protoss. And because mainstream Protoss culture feared and misunderstood them, the Dark Templar became not just exiles, but legends half buried under taboo. Tassadar, in the course of his war against the Zerg, would come into contact with this forbidden legacy. One of the central figures in this revelation was Zeratul. Zeratul is one of the great mythic presences in StarCraft. Quiet, disciplined, mysterious, and spiritually deep, he stands almost like a moving shadow of wisdom. Where many warriors display power openly, Zeratul carries power inwardly. His strength feels less like force and more like inevitability. He is a dark Templar, and through him, Tassadar begins to see what his society has long refused to acknowledge, that truth can survive beyond orthodoxy. Tassadar learns that the powers of the Dark Templar, specifically their connection to the Void, can do something ordinary Protoss methods have struggled to achieve. They can truly disrupt and destroy key Zerg consciousnesses. This is not merely a tactical discovery, it is a civilizational shock, because it means the exiles, the heretics, the rejected ones, possess knowledge and capability essential to Protoss survival. And for the Conclave, this is intolerable. Ancient ruling bodies often fear being wrong more than they fear danger itself. To admit the value of the Dark Templar would mean admitting that exile had not erased truth. It would mean admitting that the Protoss path was incomplete. It would mean weakening the authority of the system that had defined orthodoxy for generations. And so, the Conclave resisted. This is one of the recurring tragedies of the Protoss story. They are noble, they are sincere, they are not shallow villains, but they are burdened by ancient certainty, and certainty can become a prison. Tassadar, however, continues to change. He does not reject his people. He does not become casually rebellious. His path is more painful than that. He remains Protoss in the deepest sense, loyal to the survival and dignity of his civilization. But precisely because of that loyalty, he cannot ignore what he has learned. He understands that to save the Protoss, he may need to disobey the structures claiming to defend them. This is the mark of a true tragic hero. He breaks not because he cares too little, but because he cares too much to let doctrine replace reality. Meanwhile, the war grows worse. Aiur itself, the sacred homeworld of the Protoss, comes under direct Zerg assault. This is almost impossible to overstate in emotional weight. Aiur is not merely a strategic world. It is the heart of Protoss identity. Its skies, temples, cities, and histories hold the soul of the people. To threaten Aiur is to threaten more than territory. It is to threaten memory, ancestry, faith, and civilizational meaning itself. The Zerg descend upon Aiur with horrifying force, directed by the Overmind's great purpose. The old convergence of purity of form and purity of essence, twisted long ago by corruption, now seeks violent realization. The Protoss are no longer containing the war from a distance. The war is at home. And in this crisis, the divisions within Protoss society become even more dangerous. Tassadar's growing acceptance of Dark Templar knowledge places him increasingly at odds with the Conclave. What should be a moment of united adaptation becomes a struggle between survival and legitimacy, between revelation and hierarchy. The Conclave, fearful of deviation, condemns Tassadar's actions. Imagine the sorrow of that. A commander trying to save his people is treated with suspicion because the means of salvation come from the wrong source. This is how great civilizations wound themselves in moments of existential danger. And yet, Tassadar does not turn bitter in the crude sense. He does not become small. He continues to seek what must be done. He works with Zeratul. He moves closer to forbidden understanding. And in doing so, he uncovers one of the critical truths of the war. The Overmind itself can be harmed by powers linked to the Void. This discovery begins to reshape the future. If the Overmind can be struck at its deepest level, then the war is not hopeless. The Zerg are not invincible in the absolute sense, but the cost of acting on this knowledge will be enormous, because it requires breaking old barriers, challenging old structures, and facing the enemy at the center of its power. As this unfolds, the atmosphere of StarCraft grows almost sacred in its intensity. The Terrans are caught in political upheaval and survival. The Queen of Blades rises in burning darkness. The Protoss homeworld is under siege, and within the Protoss, the old split between Kala and Void, between the remembered civilization and the exiled shadow, begins to close, not through peace, but through necessity. This is one of the most beautiful themes in the entire saga, that salvation may come not from purity as a civilization defines it, but from reconciliation with what it once rejected. The Dark Templar are not simply backup warriors waiting dramatically off stage. They are the return of denied truth. They are memory coming back. They are the proof that a people cannot amputate part of itself forever and remain whole. Tassadar senses this. Zeratul embodies it. And the Conclave, for all its grandeur, struggles to accept it. Let us pause and picture Aiur in this age, a world of luminous cities now shadowed by invasion, Protoss warriors fighting with discipline beneath skies full of war, the Kala humming through minds strained by loss and fear, Dark Templar moving in hidden ways, carrying powers forbidden but necessary, Tassadar standing between obedience and revelation, the Conclave still clinging to old legitimacy, and somewhere above all of it, the Overmind pressing ever closer toward the fulfillment of its vast purpose. In the next part, we will move toward the climax of this phase of the war, the deeper alliance between Tassadar and the Dark Templar, the confrontation with the Overmind, the sacrifice that changes Protoss history, and the terrible new balance left behind afterward. For now, rest here, in the crisis of Aiur, where ancient civilization and ancient error meet beneath the same stars, where exiles return not for revenge, but for survival, and where one Protoss commander begins to understand that saving his people may require breaking the very rules they once believed eternal. And now, let us continue. One final time for this first long chapter of the StarCraft story. We have traveled from the oldest age of the Xel'Naga, through the rise of the Protoss, through humanity's exile into the Koprulu Sector, through rebellion, betrayal, infestation, and the birth of the Queen of Blades. And now the currents of all those histories converge upon Aiur, the sacred homeworld of the Protoss, the world of memory, legacy, order, and spiritual identity, the world that had once been shaped by the dreams of the Xel'Naga, the world now threatened by the most terrible consequence of those ancient dreams. The Zerg swarm had descended upon Aiur with catastrophic force. This was not a distant colonial crisis, not a frontier war, not a rumor from the edges of explored space. This was invasion at the heart. The Protoss were fighting for more than land. They were fighting for the center of themselves. To imagine Aiur under siege is to imagine a civilization confronting the possibility that even its holiest foundations may not survive history. Its shining cities, vast temples, elegant structures, and ancient pathways of thought were no longer protected by distance or reverence. War had arrived in full, and the war was changing the Protoss from within. The Conclave still tried to maintain order and authority, but events were moving beyond the control of any old institution. Tassadar had already begun his break from orthodoxy. He had learned from Zeratul and the Dark Templar that the powers of the Void could strike the Zerg in a way conventional Protoss methods could not. He had seen that the truth needed for survival lay partly outside the boundaries his civilization had long accepted. This was not easy knowledge. Truth rarely is, because truth does not always arrive as affirmation. Sometimes it arrives as humiliation. Sometimes it says that what you rejected was necessary. Sometimes it says that what you called complete was incomplete all along. The Conclave, for all its dignity and age, could not bear that easily. But the Zerg did not care about Protoss politics. The swarm moved with relentless pressure, and at the center of that pressure loomed the Overmind. The Overmind was not merely a commander. It was the living concentration of Zerg collective purpose, immense, ancient, strategic, and terrifying. Through it, the swarm was unified. Through it, the invasion of Aiur became more than an accumulation of beasts. It became directed cosmic intent. To defeat the Zerg on Aiur in any lasting way, the Overmind had to be confronted, and that confrontation would demand everything. As Tassadar drew closer to this realization, he also drew closer to the final shape of his own destiny. He had already become a controversial figure among his people, not because he sought power, but because he had accepted forbidden truth. In many stories, rebellion is easy to romanticize, but Tassadar's path is not loud or theatrical. It is sorrowful. He does not delight in defying his civilization. He grieves the necessity of it. That is part of what makes him so powerful as a character. He is not trying to tear the Protoss apart. He is trying to save them from the consequences of their own incompleteness. And in this struggle, the Dark Templar are no longer marginal figures hidden in old taboo. They become central. Zeratul, especially, stands as proof that Exile had not erased wisdom. The Dark Templar had endured in shadow, cultivating a form of psionic mastery bound to the void, subtle, silent, and profoundly dangerous to the Zerg. This is one of the great reversals in StarCraft. What had once been condemned as deviation becomes indispensable. What had once been denied returns as salvation. And yet even salvation does not come gently. During the war on Aiur, Zeratul succeeded in striking at a major Zerg cerebrate, one of the powerful subordinate command organisms within the swarm's hierarchy. This act mattered enormously, not only tactically, but spiritually and psychologically. It proved that the Zerg could be wounded through methods tied to the void. It proved that old Protoss assumptions had been wrong, but it also had another consequence. When Zeratul struck through the void, a contact occurred, a terrible recognition. For a brief moment, Zeratul and the Overmind became aware of one another. This is a haunting moment in StarCraft lore because it feels almost mythic, like two ancient shadows touching across a battlefield. Through that contact, the Overmind gained awareness of the Dark Templar and of the powers that could threaten it. Zeratul, in turn, perceived something of the vast consciousness behind the swarm. Knowledge moved both ways. The war deepened, and now time grew short. Aiur was suffering. The Protoss were divided and bleeding. The Overmind remained alive, and only a final, decisive act could break the invasion at its source. Tassadar understood this. He gathered what remained of courage, insight, and purpose, and he moved toward the final confrontation, not as a conqueror, but almost as an offering. There is a sacred feeling around what comes next, not because it is peaceful, not because it avoids suffering, but because it reveals the deepest meaning of Tassadar's character. He does not seek glory. He accepts sacrifice. He does not demand that others carry the truth for him. He carries it into death himself. In the final battle above Aiur, Tassadar took command of the Protoss carrier Gantrithor. By this point, he had embraced both the traditions of his people and the forbidden necessity represented by the Dark Templar. In him, for a moment, the old split within Protoss identity narrowed. Kala and Void, orthodoxy and exile, duty and revelation, all of it came together in one final act of will. And then Tassadar struck. With the Gantrathor, empowered through energies that united Protoss force with the void-born power needed to wound the swarm at its heart, he rammed the Overmind. It is one of the defining scenes in the entire franchise, not because it is simply spectacular, though it is, not because it is only tragic, though it is that too, but because it represents a truth earned through pain, that survival sometimes requires the union of what history has wrongly kept apart. Tassadar's sacrifice destroyed the Overmind. The great central will of the swarm was shattered, and with that, the immediate Zerg assault on Aiur lost its organizing center. But victory did not arrive as joy. Aiur had been devastated. The Protoss had paid terribly. Their society had been wounded not just in military terms, but in identity. The old order of certainty could not survive unchanged after this. The Conclave itself had been diminished. The role of the Dark Templar could no longer be denied. And Tassadar, the one who had carried revelation into action, was gone. That is why this ending feels both triumphant and mournful. The Overmind falls, but no one returns to innocence. The Protoss survive, but transformed by loss. And this, perhaps, is the true rhythm of StarCraft. No victory leaves anyone untouched. The Terrans, by now, are under the dominion of Mengsk, but that political stability is hollow and morally broken. Raynor continues apart, carrying grief, anger, and the memory of Kerrigan. The Zerg lose the Overmind, but the swarm does not simply vanish. Forces remain, structures remain, organisms remain, and among them, perhaps most dangerously of all, remains Kerrigan. Because the destruction of the Overmind does not end the deeper story. It only ends one phase of it. The galaxy after Aiur is no longer arranged as it was before. The old Protoss center has been broken. The old central Zerg authority has been shattered. The Terrans remain divided between state power and resistance, and in the spaces opened by all this collapse, new forms of power begin to rise. Kerrigan, no longer just a transformed servant within the swarm, stands poised to become something even greater, more independent, more strategic, more dangerous. Tassadar's sacrifice closes one age, but it opens the next. And so, as we end this first long StarCraft Sleep Lore chapter, let us step back and feel the whole shape of what we have traveled through. We began with the Xel'Naga, ancient shapers searching for purity of form and purity of essence. We watched the Protoss rise on Aiur, guided and then abandoned, glorious but divided. We watched primal life on Xerus become the foundation of the Zerg. We followed humanity's exile from Earth and its rebirth as the rough, fractured Terrans of the Koprulu Sector. We saw the corruption of the Confederacy, the ambition of Arcturus Mengsk, the decency of Jim Raynor, and the long tragedy of Sara Kerrigan. We watched Tarsonis burn. We watched Kerrigan become the Queen of Blades. We watched Tassadar reject rigid certainty and embrace forbidden truth. And at the end, we watched him sacrifice himself to destroy the Overmind above a dying homeworld. This is why StarCraft endures, because beneath the battles, the ships, the armies, and the iconic lines, it tells a deeper kind of story, a story about civilizations that are magnificent but incomplete, a story about power that corrupts even when it promises salvation, a story about people who are used by history, and a few who still choose, in the end, to act with conscience. A story in which old wounds return, old exiles become necessary, and old dreams become horrors when touched by domination. And perhaps, most of all, it is a story about transformation, about what is lost, about what survives, about how no one remains unchanged once drawn into the great currents of the galaxy. So now, let Aiur grow quiet. Let the stars drift farther apart. Let the fire of Tarsonis fade. Let the voice of the Overmind fall silent. Let Tassadar's sacrifice settle gently into memory, and let this first chapter of the StarCraft saga come to rest. Not in peace exactly, but in stillness, because beyond this ending, there are more stories. There is the rise of Kerrigan after the Overmind. There is brood war. There is the deeper shadow of the Xel'Naga legacy. There is Raynor's long war. There is the fate of the Protoss after Exile. There is Aemon. There is StarCraft 2. But for tonight, for this telling, we stop here, at the end of the First Great Age, at the fall of the Overmind, at the point where sacrifice holds back annihilation, and the surviving stars wait in silence for what comes next. Sleep well, and drift gently through the Koprulu Sector.